Okay, the nice report that gets put out by the World Wildlife Federation, WWF, is out for 2022. So this is produced in collaboration with ZSL for Life Everywhere. It's the Living Planet Report 2022, Building a Nature Positive Society. I think we've talked about this nature positive concept before elsewhere in my YouTube channel as one of the podcasts. So at a glance, the report is designed as a springboard for action, to provide food for thought and to act as a catalyst for transformational change. We hope it inspires you to be part of that change. So transformational change concept we discussed just a couple of podcasts ago in the dynamic adaptation pathways, where the decision concept is included in designing adaptation pathways, so the implementation becomes part of the development of adaptation strategies and avoiding maladaptation and so on. It's split into 3 chapters. The first one looks at the global double emergency. We are living through climate and biodiversity crises. These are not separate from each other but are 2 sides of the same coin. So we get a lot of news on climate change and its impacts, extremes, cyclones, hurricanes, all the disasters that are happening, versus biodiversity crisis, but often they are not really connected in the media as much as they should be, or in people's head as much as they should be, because there is human influence directly on biodiversity, habitat loss, hunting, fishing, deforestation, land conversions, urbanization, everything, versus climate change, which is happening through emissions, increases in greenhouse gases, and so on. Land use change is still the most important driver of biodiversity loss. Then the cascading impacts of climate change are already affecting the natural world. Unless we limit warming to 1.5 degrees C, climate change is likely to become the dominant cause of biodiversity loss in the coming decades. So we're talking again of the global warming target, and we have discussed this in terms of tipping points being triggered, etc. So let's keep in mind that these targets are kind of a guardrail policy emerging out of economic reports from the 1970s, economic evaluations, and so on, and not necessarily purely out of science, out of climate science. 3 photo stories explore how communities use their knowledge to adapt to local changes in climate and biodiversity. I won't go into those in my summary of the report. The second chapter looks at the speed and scale of change. Indicators help us to build up a picture of both the speed and scale of change in biodiversity around the world and the impacts of this change. So there is a Living Planet Index which looks at the relative change in the abundance, and then there is a risk extinction map produced, as well as a link of the systems in terms of how intact the biodiversity is in each place. The Living Planet Index acts as an early warning indicator by tracking trends in the abundance of mammals, fish, reptiles, birds, and amphibians around the world. The 2022 Global Living Planet Index shows an average of 69% decrease in monitored wildlife populations between 1970 and 2018. This is not a projection. This is something that has happened, and the index shows a 69% decrease in monitored wildlife populations. So we'll look at some of these in a minute. Latin America shows the greatest regional decline in average population abundance of 94% of the wildlife, terrestrial and freshwater species. Population trends for monitored freshwater species are also falling steeply at 83%. New mapping analysis techniques allow us to build up a more comprehensive picture of both the speed and scale of changes in biodiversity and climate, and to map where nature contributes most to our lives, so we can focus on transformational change to produce nature positive changes, and how to trigger action. This by putting, for example, indigenous people at the center of action in some places. This edition has been written by 89 authors from around the world, and they have drawn on a range of different knowledge sources. Chapter 3 I'll do as a separate podcast after we finish 1 and 2, but just to keep it in mind here, Chapter 3 focuses on building a nature-positive society. We know that the health of our planet is declining, and we know why. We know the human fingerprint is all over it, and we are living beyond the carrying capacity of the planet, and our per capita environmental footprint is looked at as well. We also know that we have the knowledge and means to address climate change and biodiversity loss. So that's an optimistic message saying we have what we need, the wherewithal, and we just have to get going now. The landmark recognition in July 22 by the UN General Assembly of the human right to a healthy environment cements our understanding that climate breakdown, nature loss, pollution and pandemics are human rights crises. So if you think that everybody has a right to health, nature and equitable and just climate solutions and resources, then you know that framing of the problem can be slightly different. We know that transformational change, game-changing shifts, maybe at systemic level, will be essential to bring theory into practice. So instead of a species protected here and a little protected area over there, you look at the entire biodiversity map and the linkages and the extinction risks. There must be system-wide changes in how we produce and consume, the technology we use, and our economic and financial systems. To help us imagine a future where people and nature can thrive, we have explored a number of scenarios and models, such as the pioneering Bending the Curve work featured in the Living Planet Report 2020. I didn't cover those, but I'm doing this now since the channel is new since then. But we will look at the end in chapter 3 about the role of models in bringing about these transformational changes in food systems and biodiversity and climate action together. The researchers are exploring new lenses to add to these models, including climate change impacts, equity and fairness. Linking international trade to its impact on nature is a key part of bending the curve of biodiversity loss at scale. Bending the curve is basically a paradigm where we are going in emissions up and up, and we have to bring it down, and in biodiversity loss the losses are going up and up, and we have to turn it around and get a nature positive society. In addressing these complex interlinked challenges, there is no one size fits all solution. All global warming is local. All solutions also have to be local, but they have to add up to this global protection of species and nature positive society as a whole. To illustrate this, we have collected examples from around the world, ranging from Amazon to Canada, Zambia, Kenya, Indonesia and Australia. I won't go into those case studies, but they are in the report and they are really worth looking at. Okay, so let's run through some of the data collected by the report and presented in terms of the index. Global Living Planet Index from 1970 to 2018, the average change in relative abundance of 31,821 populations, representing 5,230 species monitored across the globe, was a decline of 69% that you see from 2070 to 2018 in terms of this index value being 1 in 1970. So it's a relative change in abundance over time. The white line shows the index values, and the shaded areas represent statistical uncertainty of surrounding the trend. 95% statistical uncertainty with 63 to 75% range. And this is the Global Living Planet Index and the confidence limits. If you look regionally, North America is better than the global average, but Latin America and the Caribbean are much worse. Obviously, this is how averages come out. Central Asia, Europe and Central Asia did better for a while, and then they have hit negative more recently since about 2010 as well, even though the range went negative as far back as the 1990s in terms of the confidence limits. Africa, unfortunately, also pretty bad bad at minus 66%, and finally Asia and the Pacific is also at minus 55% over this period of 1970 to 2018. So we are all in this together. There are no real do-gooders on the planet. Everybody is doing their part in destroying biodiversity and wildlife losses. Living Planet report again looks at the freshwater living planet index from 1970 to 2018, again looking at the index and the confidence limits like as before. The average abundance of 6,617 freshwater populations across the globe, representing 1,398 species, declined by 83%, which is really a large number. The white line shows the index values, and the shaded areas represent the statistical uncertainties as before. Okay, here is the freshwater migratory fish living planet index, which declined by 76%, and it covered 1,406 monitored populations of 247 species, so not small numbers. There is a way they compute the extinction risk. Also IUCN is involved in this. So the red list index, you are looking at the schematic here in terms of the representation. List of red list index of species survival. If you're in this direction, you're doing better. You're worse off with respect to the baseline when you are here. So it shows trends in survival probability, which is the inverse of extinction risk over time. Red line index value of 1 equates to all species within a group qualifying as least concern, i.e. not expected to become extinct in the near future. An index value of 0 equates to all species having gone extinct in a group. A constant value over time indicates that the overall extinction risk for the group is unchanged from 1980 to 2020. If the rate of biodiversity losses were reducing, the index would show an upward trend. A decline in the index means that species are being driven towards extinction at an accelerating rate. This is from the International Union of Conservation Network. So you can see that corals have a large downward slope here heading towards extinction. Birds have remained almost flat. Bony fishes, not enough data, as we will see in the next one. Cone snails up here doing in the better regime. Legumes, dragonflies, monocots, reptiles, crustaceans, sharks and rays, conifers, amphibians showing a slight decline, and cicads showing more recently a sharper decline, starting already at a low level in terms of the red line index of species survival, so high risk overall. So this is the kind of scale where it's gray, it's not evaluated, indeterminate, fully recovered, slightly depleted, moderately depleted, largely depleted, and critically depleted red list here, extinct in the wild already, and extinct overall. Of course, there are many examples of turtles and birds and some reptiles having been assumed gone extinct or not seen for a long time, but they were then cited somewhere, indicating that they may have found a niche in which they somehow survived, a refugia in the warming and so on. We have discussed the concept of refugia elsewhere. Looking at the global hotspots of risk with this scale here going from 1 to 12, the relative importance of each pixel across species and threats as measured by the number of times a pixel falls into a hotspot region for any taxon or threat. Hotspot regions are defined as locations containing the highest 10% of the numbers of species at risk from each major threat and taxonomic group. So just pay attention to the amount of red colors that are there, and as we said before, Latin America is and South America in general is bad news. Of course, this is entirely almost all in the Amazon, and Amazon is used as an example of action in the report that I'm not including here. But Africa and Europe and Eurasia and South Asia, Southeast Asia and Australia are not doing that well either. Himalayas here showing very high global hotspots of risk for biodiversity and so on. This is also a hotspot. So on down to Burmese Mountain into Indonesia, Malaysia, Borneo, and so on and so forth. Just to look at a few more species, oceanic shark living planet index for small, less than 250 centimeter sizes, credible intervals. Oceanic shark LPI maximum 250 to 500. So the different colors, different sizes for greater than 500 cm, and you can see that the numbers vary, but obviously living planet index has crashed quite significantly from 1970 to 2018 for all sharks, small, medium and large sharks. Okay. Here you are with short-fin mako, living planet index minus 38%. This is the oceanic white-tip shark living planet index, drop of 75% over the early 1990s to 2018. Sharks are now big target of all kinds of illegal activities, and protecting them is not easy in the wild ocean, where it's still Wild West in terms of illegal ships doing all kinds of damage because of demand for shark fin soup and other things. This is a white shark, and it has shown some recovery after crashing early on after the 1970s into the 80s and staying down there, but you can see that it's still at overall minus 37% loss compared to the baseline at 1970. So overall biodiversity intactness index for year 2020 at a quarter of a degree resolution. This again looks at the wholeness of a system in a given area. So you can see that the K here is the global average of 77%, and reddish areas show high intactness in many regions here in the Amazon, Sahara, and much of the rest of the world. So you have to combine the risks, the living planet index, and the biodiversity intactness index. Idea is not to panic, but to come up with plans on how to lead socio-technical transitions, socio-ecological transitions towards transformational change. One of the ideas is to consider traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous science and indigenous knowledge in their practice, law, language, story and ceremony, so that the interrelationships between traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous science and indigenous knowledge systems can be used to bring about action and protection. So they are depicted here using symbology of the life cycle of Pacific salmon, starting with salmon egg at the core of the image. The understandings and the philosophies embedded with this center are carried through time and across generations through language, story, ceremony, practice and law. Salmon and salmon people not only coexist in these settings but are interdependent on one another. So the idea is that they have a better sense of respecting the resource from where they're getting their livelihoods and food and so on, and to put them at the center of protecting those systems. So I will leave this podcast here on chapter 1 and 2 and come back and look at chapter 3 in a separate podcast, focusing on various issues of bringing about change using models to map the future of protective actions, combining biodiversity, reducing extinction risks, as well as climate actions and so on. Okay.